You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat B'Shemesh Israel, 5775, 2014. This week's Parsha is Parshas Mikeitz. In the Parsha, the very beginning of the Parsha, we have Yosef HaTzadik. Joseph, he's incarcerated, he's stuck in jail, he's been there for 12 years. And finally, 2 years after the dreams of the Sar HaMashkim, the Sar HaOfim, the baker, and the royal wine bearer, the cupbearer of Paro, of Pharaoh, 2 years after that dream, it was the end of 2 years, and Paro has his dreams with the 7 fat cows, the 7 skinny cows, the 7 wholesome grains of wheat, and the 7 skinny grains of wheat. And we know the whole story, how Yosef comes out of jail, he becomes the viceroy, becomes the second in command to Paro, to Pharaoh, and the Torah continues and tells us the whole story of his interactions with his brothers. Now, without going into the whole rest of the story, I'd like to focus in really on the very beginning of the Parsha and also the end of last week's Parsha, where Yosef HaTzadik is forgotten by the Sar HaMashkim. He gives him this good advice, he gives him this good pitaron, this explanation of his dream, and he says to him, "You're going to be reinstated in 3 days. Please remember me, don't forget about me. I was unjustly thrown into jail, and I would like you to please remember me and ask Pharaoh to take me out of jail." Now, the Torah tells us that what happens after that is that indeed he forgets. The Sar HaMashkim, the cupbearer of Pharaoh, forgets about Yosef, and it's not until 2 years later when Paro has his dreams, which is the beginning of this week's Parsha, by Mikeitz, at the end of 2 years, that's when the dreams occur, and indeed Yosef is taken out and becomes second in command to Paro. Now, I'd like to share with you 2 midrashim. One is at the very beginning of this week's Parsha, and one is at the very end of last week's Parsha. And these 2 midrashim, if we understand them at their depth, they hold a very powerful message for each of us, and I believe it's also connected very much to the concept of Chanukah, the days that we're experiencing right now. The midrash begins this week's Parsha, Parshas Mikeitz, and it says as follows: Vayehi Mikeitz shnasayim yamim. The Torah starts off the Parsha with the statement that it was at the end of 2 years. Now, the Medrash, as is its way, before giving us the Medrash, the teaching about the Parsha itself, it will sometimes give us a related teaching that's connected. And it says here like this: keitz sam lachoshech. There's a verse in Eov, in Job, chapter 28, verse 3. It says that there was an end that was placed for the darkness. Zman nosan la'olam kama shonim yeyoseh ba'afela. The Medrash darshans, the Medrash understands that when the Torah tells us that there's an end to darkness, that the teaching is that there's a certain amount of time that's apportioned in the world for there to be darkness in the world. And what is it referring to? What's this darkness? What's it referring to? As long as the evil inclination is in the world, there is darkness and there's a shadow of death in the world. Because the verse over there, the same verse in Job, in Eov, says that there's darkness and the shadow of death. But there's a set amount of time that this is going to be true, that there's going to be a Yetzirah, an evil inclination in the world, that there will be negativity in the world, that there will be a desire for man to do evil. Now, what happens in the future time when the Messiah arrives? The Yetzirah, the evil inclination, is removed from the world. So there will no longer be darkness in the world. There will no longer be the shadow of death. We'll move on from this state of there being the potential for death. People will live forever. That's the first explanation of that verse, the first aspect of this keitz, this set amount of time. Now, davar acher, what's another explanation which is connected to our parsha? Keitz sam lachoshech, that God created an end, a set amount of time for the darkness. Zman nasan liYosef, kama shonim yaseh ba'afela b'beis hasurim. There was a specific amount of time that was set for darkness in regards to Yosef. Joseph was going to be in jail for a certain specific amount of years. Kevan shegia hakeitz. Once the end of that amount of time came, Chalom Paro Chalom, that's when Pharaoh had his dream, which would then cause Yosef to be brought out of the jail and indeed to become the viceroy, to step out of that darkness of his life, to step out of the Beis Hasurim, the jail in which he was incarcerated. Now, we've noted numerous times that when you have a medrash, and the medrash brings down a few different concepts consecutively in the same breath, so to speak, in the same mishnah, in the same teaching within the medrash, so there's a parallel. It's not just by coincidence that the medrash has a teaching about this verse that seems to be two completely different ideas. One has to do with Mashiach, one has to do with Messiah coming, the end of the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, and one has to do with Yosef HaTzadik, the end of his time of being incarcerated. Now, they seem to be unrelated, unconnected, but when the Medrash puts these two concepts within the same teaching, so it's coming to say that there is a very deep and important connection, and we need to learn out, we need to understand what is that connection, what does that teach us. Now, before we try to understand the connection between these two, what we need to look at, we need to try to understand is the concept of the keitz. We see that the Torah is telling us that it's the end of 2 years. It's the end of Yosef HaTzadik, of Joseph's time being incarcerated. He's been there for 2 years beyond the 10 years that he was already there previously. So he's been in jail for 12 years. And this is the end of the jail sentence, so to speak. And it's the beginning of a new life for Yosef. It's the beginning of his rise to power, his rise to being in a position of leadership over Pharaoh, but also eventually over the Jewish people as well. Now we see that the concept of keitz, in this medrash, we see that the end is not just in regards to Yosef, the end of his incarceration, but it's also true in regards to the end of the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, of the darkness, the spiritual darkness within which we find ourselves today, that we've been in for the last 5,775 years. So you have the concept of end in regards to Yosef, and in regards to the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, and the advent of the times of Mashiach. Now, what is the concept of keitz? What does it mean, the end? What does it mean, the end? It's not really the end, it's the beginning, right? It's the beginning of a new era. But what does it mean, the end? What's the concept of keitz? So I was thinking about the concept of keitz, and I noticed that the word keitz, which means end, is the same exact letters as the word kotz. The word kotz means a thorn. But besides for meaning a thorn, it can also mean a spike or a crown, the top of something. And I'll tell you where you find it. We find that in the letters of the Torah and the letters in Hebrew, so each of the different letters has a different shape and a different form. And the letter Yud, the way that it's written inside of the Torah, is that it has a little bit of a spike sticking up above it. It's called a kotz. It's called a kotz shel Yud, the top of the Yud. Now, classically in Kabbalah, the concept of Hashem's name, which is Yud, and then a Hey, and then a Vav, and then a Hey, that name, you have 4 letters, and each of those different letters corresponds to a different aspect of reality, a different way that Hashem, that God manifests within reality. There are many parallels, there are many different ideas that are connected to it, but I don't want to get into that at all. What I do want to get into is that they speak about the Yud of Hashem's name, the first letter of Hashem's name, as being the highest aspect of our interaction with Hashem, but there's an even deeper aspect of Hashem's name, which is contained within the kotz shel Yud, which is that little crown that sticks up above the Yud. If you look at any Yud, that letter Yud inside of a Sefer Torah, or you look at it in a Siddur, so it sticks up a little bit. There's a little crown on top of that Yud. And the kotz shel Yud corresponds to the aspect of the transcendent realm. It corresponds to Keser, which means the crown. And just like a crown sits upon the head, so too the aspect of the kotz shel Yud, of the crown of the Yud, is something that transcends beyond the reality that we experience into a higher reality, into a place beyond place, into a time beyond time. Now, I'd like to focus not so much on the place beyond place, the transcendent realm, the reality which contains our physical reality, but I want to focus in on the transcendent time, the time beyond time, because Hashem is referred to as Yud Kei Vav Kei, which means Haya Hoy V'Viyeh, that God was, God is, and God will be. God is beyond time. For us, we experience God as always. He always was, He always is, He always will be. But for Hashem, God Himself is beyond time. He's transcendent. He's outside of time. And so He sees all times as present. That's how the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, explain the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And so the thing that we're experiencing, the thing that we're seeing here in this Medrash, and the concept of Mikeitz, the concept of reaching an end point, it's not really an end point, because time always was, always is, always will be, as we experience time. Time, we're talking about, there's something, you can't really talk about an end point. If you think about it, in fact, there really is no other time except for now. Yes, there was a time that was yesterday, but when it was yesterday, it was now, meaning our experience of time is always now. So in a certain sense, you can't really talk about the end of time, or what does it mean, the end of time? We talk about keitz hayamim. We talk about the end of days, the end, the Mikeitz. What is this concept of keitz? What does it mean, the end of time? What is the kotz? There's something here which I think that's being hinted to, or the depth of this concept of Mikeitz, the end of time, is what's really coming to speak about is the keitz, the crown, the transcendent, the entering into a transcendent realm. I once saw it explained that when Adam HaRishon sinned, originally there were supposed to be 6 days of creation. On the 6th day, Adam HaRishon was created. When Adam and Eve sinned, they created a spiritual implosion of all of reality, both the physical reality, the spiritual reality, but it had an effect on time. And now instead of there being 6 days, 6 literal days of 24 hours, now there's got to be 6 days of 1,000 years. That's why we're in the year 5,775. We're now at the end, towards the end of the 6th day, so to speak. Each day for Hashem, a day is 1,000 years. Time has imploded. And so we have a different experience of time. Instead of time being straightforward 24 hours, 1 day at a time, you now have 1,000 years for each day. Time has expanded, and more time is needed in order to create a tikkun, to rectify what was supposed to be rectified immediately in a short amount of time. Now the rectification requires a longer amount of time, 1,000 years for each day of creation. Now that's represented in this medrash by the statement that Zman Nosan La'olam Kama Hashem Yosef Afela. Hashem set a certain amount of time that there's supposed to be darkness in the world. We are in a lower dimension. We can't see Hashem clearly. There's an evil inclination. There's darkness. There's spiritual darkness that we're speaking about. There is a keitz. There is an end to this spiritual darkness. And when we get to that end, so what's the keitz? As we said before, the keitz is the kotz. It's this crown. It's this ascendance into a higher spiritual realm. When we hit that point, we get, in a certain sense, ejected out of this lower realm into a higher realm, into a place where time is different. We go back. We're back on the 6th day of creation, so to speak, after we've completed the rectification, which took all of this time and which took all of this darkness in order to have the free will, in order to bring back the light into the darkness. That's another conversation for another time. But the idea is that there's a breakdown in time, and it requires we have to go through this time. We have to go through this expansion, or really it's an implosion of time. And Yosef Atzadik as well has to go through that. And what happens when he gets to the end, when he gets to the keitz, which is really a kotz, which is ejecting him out of the darkness and into the light. Now all of a sudden he's going to experience a new place, a new time, a new experience of time, a new experience where the darkness implodes and explodes, and now he becomes the leader over Mitzrayim, over Egypt. You know, as I was thinking about this idea, I was noticing that this could explain, you know, when we see the story, we watch the story progresses. So Yosef's brothers come in, and it says that Yosef recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. They're still existing in a lower realm. They still haven't reached their keitz. Each person has their own personal keitz, where they get to a certain space in their reality where all of the darkness ends and they're ejected, and they come up into a higher place, into a transcendent place. They reach their keitz. They reach the kotz. They reach that crown, that transcendent place. Yosef had already reached that place, but the brothers had not yet reached that place. They would reach that place. They will reach that place by the beginning of next week's Parsha, when they transcend. By Yigash, Yehuda steps up. He moves out of his place, and he enables all of his brothers to enter into a higher place. But they still hadn't reached that place. So when Yosef meets them, he recognizes them. He can look down from the higher realm, and he can see them in their lower realm, but they don't recognize him. Part of the reason they couldn't recognize him is because he was a completely different person. He was in a completely different spiritual space than they were. They couldn't even touch him. They couldn't even really grasp where he was and where he was holding. And so they didn't see him at all. They just saw an outer manifestation. They saw him superficially, and so they couldn't even recognize him. They didn't see him as the brother that they knew at all. They just saw him on a superficial level from where they were. Now, there's one more medrash which I want to share with you, which is from the end of last week's Parsha, which I believe is very much connected into this medrash. We can look at this and we can say, well, how does one reach this keitz? How does one get to that place? Is it something that just happens on its own? We find that in referring to the keitz hayamim, in referring to the Mashiach's times, which is referred to in this medrash, our Chazal tell us that Be'ita Achishena, the Torah refers to a time when that Mashiach is going to come, when the Messiah is going to arrive. It refers to it as, in its time, I will hasten it. And our sages tell us, what does it mean, in its time, I will hasten it? Is there a set time, or can it be hastened? Can we speed things up or not? Can we get Mashiach to come faster through our deeds? And the Medrash says, the Chazal say in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that Be'ita, if we merit, so then achishena. If we have this chuyos, if we do our part, so it's possible that we can speed things up. But Be'ita, if we don't merit it, so then it comes in its specific special time. So there are really two different ways that it can come, or it could be that they overlap, they overlay. That's a whole other conversation as well. But the idea is that there are things that we can do to move the keitz, to the end should come sooner, so to speak. And there are certain things that we can't do, that it comes in its time, and that we can't change things. We do see that for Yosef himself, the fact that he trusted the Saramashkim, he put too much trust. He said, don't forget about me, please remember me. That was too much. He overdid it. Our Chazal tell us that as a result of that, instead of coming out of incarceration after 10 years, it would be another 2 years. It was going to take 12 years that he would have to come out of his incarceration. So we see that the keitz can be changed. It can be affected by our level of merit, how much we're connected to Hashem, how much we're connected to the deeper aspect, which is where the keitz is, which is the transcendent aspect. Meaning, if we're connected, if Yosef HaTzadik would have been connected into Hashem through bitachon, by trusting in Hashem, so then he would have been able to access the keitz sooner. He would have been able to enter into the transcendent realm because he was already attached to the transcendent realm. Now, the medrash I'd like to share with you, if we look at it carefully, we can see that there's another aspect of that really we can access if we want to enter into the transcendent realm now and thereby draw the transcendent realm into the present sooner. We want to bring the keitz quicker. There's a hint in a medrash which tells us how we can do that. So let's see this medrash. It says like this: Sar hamashkim shchachacha, v'ani loy eshkachecha. God says, Hashem says, that the cupbearer, Pharaoh's cupbearer, he forgot about you, but I will not forget you. So Hashem is speaking to Joseph before he was released from incarceration. And then the Medrash goes on to tell us that there are other places where Hashem waited for somebody. Hashem here waited for Yosef HaTzadik. Hashem waited for others. Mihaya mechaka la'Avram v'Sara. There were numerous instances in the Torah where people had to wait. And they had to be patient in order to experience a transcendent reality, in order to experience a miraculous reality. Who was waiting for Abraham and Sarah? Shahayu Zikanim, they were elderly. Shivod lahem ben. Who was waiting for them that they should have a child? Mi mechaka liYaakov. Who was waiting for Jacob? She'avar b'makli hayarden. He had nothing when he went over to Laban's house, when he went to Haran. He had nothing, he just had his stick. She'yifort v'yashir. Who was waiting for him to become very wealthy? Yosef, who was waiting for Joseph? He had all these challenges. Who was waiting for him to become the king? Who was waiting for Moses? He was thrown into the Nile. He was there. He was forlorn. That he would become who he was meant to become. Who was waiting for Ruth? She was a proselyte, that she would become the forebear of the kingship of the people of Israel. Who's waiting for King David? And really it's referring to Mashiach ben David, the Messiah who comes from David, who's going to be the king for all of the generations. And who waited for Yoyachin to come out of the incarceration? Who waited for Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah to come out of the fire. And the Medrash goes on to say a few different things. Who is waiting for the exiles to be finished so that the Jewish people will come out and they will have great honor? Who is waiting? Who is waiting for the reinstatement, the rebuilding of the temple of David, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem is going to put up. Hashem says, I'm going to raise up that temple of David, so that the entire world will be one, joined together to serve Hashem. So what's interesting about the Medrash is it keeps saying, who is waiting, who is waiting, who is waiting? And it doesn't really answer the question, who is waiting. It's obvious who's waiting, it's Hashem who's waiting. But the Medrash, by saying who is waiting, it's asking a question, who is waiting? Because it's coming to teach us that there's a question, there's a waiting. When a person asks a question, who? It says in the pasuk, raise up your eyes to the heavens, and see who was it that created this? Me. Who is it? Obviously it's Hashem. But when a person asks the question and doesn't necessarily give the answer, he waits. He waits for the answer. The natural inclination of a person is to want to give the answer. I know all the answers, but that's the ego. That's the egotistical part of the human being. I know all the answers. Who is waiting? Who is waiting? Who is waiting? It's Hashem who's waiting, but who is waiting? The deep message here is that the Yosef HaTzadik is placed into jail. Why is he placed into jail? Why does he go through the suffering? Why is it that Avram Avinu, that Abraham and Sarah can't have children until the elderly? They're waiting so long. Why are they waiting? Why is there so much waiting in history? Why are we waiting for Ruth? Why are we waiting for David? Why are we waiting for Mashiach? Why are we waiting for the exiles to be finished? Why are we waiting? And the answer is the question. The question is the answer. That in order to get into the keitz, to get into that transcendent place, you have to be in a place which is beyond time. When you're waiting, when a person learns how to wait, when he learns how to ask the question, who? I don't have the answers. Who is it that created? I can't understand Hashem. How can I fathom Hashem? How can I fathom? When I have the question of how can I fathom? Where is Hashem? Who is Hashem? What are we waiting for? And I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. I enter, in my waiting, I transcend. I enter into that transcendent realm. When a person experiences challenges and difficulty, he asks the question, he says, how could it be? Where are you, Hashem? He waits. If it's done correctly, he's waiting and he touches Hashem there. He touches Hashem in the waiting, in the challenge, in the difficulty. He touches Hashem. And to the degree that he touches Hashem, that's how he's able to draw down the ultimate keitz into this realm. He's able to speed up the keitz. He's able to touch the kotz, the crown, the transcendent realm. He's able to bring it down into this very physical realm. Hashem should bless you. Hashem should bless me. Hashem should help us all to be able to wait, to be able to ask the question, who is waiting? To be able to reach that keitz, to be able to reach the end of our personal trials and tribulations, to be able to reach that personal transcendent realm, and also to reach the realm which we are all waiting for, the times of Mashiach, when we'll experience the end, the keitz of all of the darkness, of all of the gullus. We'll be able to see that light which we shined in Hanukkah, that light, that little light that shines through the darkest places, the darkest realms, out into the entire world. And we'll see that that little light was a spark of the incredibly great light. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a light-filled Hanukkah. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.